Welcome to Live from Plato's Cave. I am Mario Veen. This is episode 44, World-Changing Organisms with Stephen Porder. Understandably, most people want to focus on the solutions to climate change. We live now and we have to act now with great urgency. So why should we care about what a single-celled organism did to the Earth's climate billions of years ago? Well, Plato's allegory of the cave is about getting beyond the water to the fish, the air to the birds. It's about the stuff that we cannot see because it's all around us. Time is our water to the fish, just like the chemical elements that all matter and all life is made of. And as it turns out, humans are not the first organisms to change the Earth's climate. We're not even the second organism to do that. We are the third. And when we understand what this means, a new pathway through the climate crisis emerges. I'm happy to share this conversation with you that I had with Stephen Porder about his book Elemental, How 5 Elements Changed Earth's Past and Will Shape Our Future. People often ask me for book recommendations to get up to speed with what's happening with climate. And I always recommend Under the Sky We Make by climate scientist Kimberly Nicholas. And also Timefulness by geoscientist Marcia Björnerud. I talked to her a few times before on the podcast. But since I read it a few months ago, I added Elemental to this list. Stephen's book shows us that, yes, the problems are big, huge even. And yes, we are not doing enough and we're not doing it fast enough. We need to change and we need to change really fast. But we can face those problems. If we listen to science, if we use the technology that's available to us, and if we try to look at things objectively, we can find a path through the climate crisis and emerge to a better future. Stephen Porder is the Associate Provost for Sustainability and Acacia Professor of Ecology, Evolution and Organismal Biology and Environment and Society at Brown University in the United States. His research publications explore tropical rainforest ecology, the impacts of intensive agriculture on people and the environment, and the potential for large-scale tropical forest restoration. And Stephen is also the founder and scientific lead on a radio show and podcast called Possibly, which is a practical guide to the transition to a more sustainable future. So just before we get to the interview, just a few words about the book Elemental. In this book, Stephen reveals how microbes, plants and people use the fundamental building blocks of life to alter the climate, and with it the trajectory of life on Earth in the past, present and future. So it's quite amazing to realize how we are connected but also different from these two other organisms, land plants and cyanobacteria. And Stephen focuses on the 5 elements of life's formula: hydrogen, oxygen, carbon, nitrogen and phosphorus. He shows how these elements underpin the success of human civilization and how their mismanagement threatens similarly catastrophic unintended consequences. But if we can learn from our world-changing predecessors, we can construct a more sustainable future. It's so great to speak to you. I have to get used to your voice a little bit because I listened to this book as an audiobook.
Yeah, I actually haven't listened to the audiobook, but I did listen to the various people they were thinking of to read it. And it's very strange to hear someone else's voice reading your words on an audiobook, so I didn't listen to it.
I do that sometimes when I'm writing because Word also has this audio function, so I listen to text sometimes because you hear it in a different way.
I should probably do that next time I write something.
But yeah, so first of all, thank you for writing this book because we just discussed a little bit about Marcia Björnerud, and my background is in philosophy and social science. So I don't really have a beta background, and then I really appreciate it when people like you take the time to translate complex matter for us, but in a way that is not condescending. I mean, it is quite complex, and even in your book, it gets quite complex as well, but we're still able to follow it.
Yeah, I'm a firm believer that those of us who do science on matters that are of interest to the general public, and certainly climate and environment are 2 very big issues for our century. If we work in that space, we have an obligation to try and communicate our results or the ideas that we're coming up with in a way that is digestible. I also think that although it is quite complicated, at its core, it's not that complicated. We tend to obfuscate by using big words and jargon in ways that we don't have to. I mean, I think Einstein said something like, if you can't explain it simply, you probably don't understand it well yourself. And so that's probably not an exact quote. So yeah, I really enjoy trying to talk about these ideas with everybody. It's actually the part of my job I like the most.
And do you have any special techniques that you use? Like, I mean, I notice you use a lot of metaphors that make it kind of visual. And are there other things that you do?
I try to imagine explaining it to somebody who's smart and interested, but doesn't know my language. So I think a lot, my mom read Stephen Jay Gould and Stephen Hawking and other scientists who wrote for a general audience. And I grew up in a house where we had Natural History magazine, where Stephen Jay Gould published an essay every month. And she would, in her very neat hand, she would circle the page that the essay started on and then leave your initials next to it if she thought it was interesting. And so I often think about my mom and how could I write it for her? She was very smart, she was very educated, she was very interested, but she didn't happen to know the jargon of my particular subdiscipline because she wasn't in my particular subdiscipline. And so I think about writing for her. I think I have a brother who is a writer, a playwright and a movie writer, and I often think about writing for him. He's another person who is fascinated by science, but has almost no formal science education at all. Maybe he took science in high school or something, but never after that. And so I think about writing for him as well.
Yeah, it's funny because I do that as well. My grandmother passed away a long time ago, but sometimes I think about how would I explain this to her, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. And is it true that you started out as a history major in college?
Yeah. So I went to a liberal arts college. The education system in the US is quite different than in Europe.
Yeah.
You have more time to think about what you want to do. And so I got to college and really had liked history in high school, although I also had liked science, and it was pretty easy to be a history major. You just had to take 8 out of your 32 classes had to be history classes. So that seemed reasonable. I took science classes also and ended up really wanting to write an honors thesis because I thought that it was a new kind of education to try and write this big thing over the course of a year. And I didn't have enough classes in my sciences to do an honors thesis in sciences. So I did it with my history major. And I'm really grateful that I did. It taught me a lot about how to write. And, it's not so different than any other thing. You have, in history, you're trying to figure out why something happened. And that's the same in science, right? The difference is the tools that you bring to that are somewhat different. You can do different things in science than you can in history because history only happened once and you can't do replicated experiments or stuff like that. And people are really complicated. But yeah, it's all the same. It's all trying to figure out why the world looks the way it does. And so I still read a lot of history for fun and a lot of political science and even some political philosophy. And so not as much as you, though, so I don't want to talk too much about political philosophy. But yeah, I was a history major and I'm very grateful to have done that.
Yeah, I guess it's also really connecting to this topic, right? Because one of the things later, I want to speak about climate models a little bit, but there you also speak about, we're kind of performing a big experiment.
Yes, we are. Unfortunately, it's an unreplicated one. So it makes it very hard to figure out what's driving what if you only have one example, because everything is happening at the same time. But we've made a lot of progress, and we can talk about climate models whenever we get to that topic. But we've made a lot of progress in figuring out why the Earth is changing right now in the way that it is. But it does rely a lot on building essentially replicated Earths in a computer to try to understand the different things that might be changing things.
Yeah. Yeah, so in this podcast, I really try to use interdisciplinary approaches, and one of the things I love most is with people who already connecting different fields. And a few episodes ago, I talked to Fabian Erkan, and he's a climate biologist. So he studies also ancient leaves, and we talked a little bit about the connection between geology and biology. And your field, if I'm correct, is biogeochemistry. So then we also toss chemistry into the mix. Could you talk a little bit about how the world looks from the perspective of biogeochemistry?
Sure. And I should say that after I finished my history degree, I actually got a master's degree in geology. And I didn't even know my field of biogeochemistry existed until I was in my mid to late 20s. It wasn't something that was offered at my college. It wasn't something that I learned about when I was studying the deep history of Earth in my master's in geology. And it wasn't until I really started my PhD program that I understood what it was. I think the easiest way to explain biogeochemistry is to look at its roots, no pun intended, which are in farming. If you want to be a successful farmer and grow your crop, you need to understand the biology of the plants that you're growing and how that interacts with the geology and chemistry of the soil and environment that those plants grow in. And so you might imagine that you would grow different crops in the tropics than you would grow in Europe, and the different varieties of plants would do differently on different types of soil. Every farmer knows this, but this is the origin of the idea that you have to integrate the understanding of both the living and unliving world in order to get a picture of what's happening on Earth. It's not just the rocks, it's not just the water. It's the interaction between the rocks and the water and the temperature and the living organisms that shapes our planet. And I think for me, one of the most profound realizations that that field allows is to understand the two-way street that is our living planet. And what I mean by that is we all learn that Earth is a living planet. And I think all of us naturally understand that as the Earth has living things on it. But actually, it's also the case that Earth is profoundly shaped by the living things on it. So it's not just that Earth hosts life, but Earth is completely transformed by life. And so life is shaped by the planet it lives on, but the planet is shaped by the life on it. And biogeochemistry really tries to understand how that happens in both directions. So how are the living things shaped by the environment that they live in? And how is the environment shaped by the living things in it? And so that is at its core, I think, what biogeochemistry is about.
When did you start getting interested in the climate change?
When I started my PhD in the year 2000, and I was told by a very eminent ecologist at the time that if we didn't get emissions under control in the next decade, we were totally, I won't use his word, but we were in big trouble. And I went through graduate school. I finished in 2005. I did a postdoc. I started as a faculty member at Brown University in 2007. And by the end of the decade, in 2010, it was very clear that we hadn't gotten anything under control, and that we were really headed in a very, very, very bad direction. And I continued to do and continue to do basic research, but felt more and more like basic science was not all I wanted to be doing for the second half of my career. And so I started working harder on direct impacts on emissions in particular and on sustainability in general, and took on a new role in the university overseeing and guiding our sustainability efforts, and particularly our elimination of fossil fuel combustion from our campus. And so that now is about half of my job. So I would say from let's say the mid 2010s on, I really began to focus on this holistic view of not only describing the problem, which I had done for my entire career, but really actively and purposefully and primarily working on solutions. And I did that both because I thought that was important, obviously, but also because personally I couldn't get up every morning and work just on describing the disaster that was coming. I really needed to get up every morning and work as hard as I could on preventing as much of the damage as I could and moving us in a positive direction. And I have to say, it's really changed my whole worldview. to have a positive mission every day as opposed to a describing the problem mission. And it's changed how I view environmentalism, and it's changed how I view how we teach environmental science. And so it really has profoundly shaped my thinking over the last decade to have this more positive vision of where we're going as opposed to description of the disaster of where we're going.
No. Yeah, and I speak to a lot of people in the climate movement and also some of the previous guests. And one of the things that always comes up is, do you have any hope? What reason do we have to have hope? Or is it just, it's already getting pretty bad, but we can limit it a little bit?
A really important question. And I am very hopeful, and I will say I am more optimistic than I was a decade ago. And I think there are three reasons for that. The first is that we're making enormous progress. If you had asked climate scientists 10 or 15 years ago, how much warmer will the planet be by the end of the century? They might have said 4 or 5 degrees Celsius relative to pre-industrial times, which everybody agreed would be an unmitigated disaster, like almost inconceivable. And if you ask now, they say probably around 3. Now, there's 2 ways to look at that. 3 degrees Celsius warmer than pre-industrial will be really, really bad. We're not even at 1.5 yet. So it will be a radically transformed world and very, very challenging. But that's a whole lot better than 4.5 or 5, right? So that's one reason I'm hopeful. The second is that we tend to be bad at estimating rapid changes. And part of that means climate change is going to be more dangerous and have worse effects than we think for each increment of warming. But part of that is also that we tend to underestimate how fast things can change. If you had asked me in the year 2000 if I was going to have a phone that I could carry around in my pocket, I would have said that was ridiculous, or that I wouldn't need a landline. And if you had asked me if I was going to be taking pictures on that phone, or I was going to be driving an electric car or whatever, I would have said, no, of course not. And, things have changed very quickly. Since 2008, we have underestimated how fast coal will be phased out every single year. And we've underestimated the deployment of renewables every single year since 2008. So there's a lot to be hopeful for. I don't want to sugarcoat it. It's going to be a very difficult transition. But for me, that just means we got to roll up our sleeves and work harder. There's no point in wringing our hands and burying our head in the sand about it. Every ton of carbon that we can keep out of the air is going to be a hugely important ton. And so, am I optimistic that it's going to be perfect? No. Is it going to be really hard? Yes. Can we make it better than it would be if we didn't try? Absolutely. So that's sort of the attitude I try to bring to it.
Why is this topic? Because if you write a book, how long did it take you to write a book? A year, 2 years? It's a lot of work, right?
It's a lot of work. One of the things that I really wanted to talk about in the book is how understanding how life interacts with the earth generally, not just humans, can help us put our modern environmental challenges in perspective. And so I spend a lot of time in the book, as you know, talking about other organisms that have really changed the world. And there aren't that many of them, but those that did share a lot of similarities with humans. And I think that by understanding those similarities and we can talk much more about that, and we will, I'm sure, we can actually inform how to transition to a more sustainable future. I think one of the real challenges with this idea of sustainability is that it means everything. So in some ways, it doesn't mean anything at all. And I think my approach is, if you want to criticize, it's a bit reductionist, but it also sort of gets at the core of why we are changing the planet. And we are changing the planet by altering the flows of a few really, really important elements that dictate basically how life on Earth works. And so if we can understand that and shift from sort of managing those elements by neglect to managing those elements with some sort of purpose, we can make a really good head start on a more sustainable future. And so, and by elements, I mean actually like atoms, like the kinds of elements that life is made of, and that play such an outsized role in determining what our environment is like.
No. Yeah, I understand why Marcia Björnrud wrote a blurb for your book as well. And she has this book, it's called Timefulness. And because there's a lot of people who say like you, well, this is a big problem, but we just really have to get to work and just, focus on the solutions and what we can do now. But then you come along and you say, okay, but let me tell you about this single-celled organism that lived 2.5 billion years ago. And it really, for me, it fits very closely to what she writes about how we understand time and in these unimaginable timescales on Earth. And yeah, billions, millions, thousands, hundreds, it all becomes meaningless.
Yeah.
But then, so one of the ways, she tells the story more in the story of the Earth, like alive, I guess. And the climate biologist I talked about last time, it's very close to the Netflix series, Life on Our Planet. Do you know it?
I haven't seen it.
Okay, so I really loved it, actually. And he said it's pretty accurate. And there because they also have to choose a storyline, and there they choose the big five. So there's like the five climate and ecological, or the crisis, or the five
mass
extinctions. Yeah. So, and you now reduce it to three elements, which is also nice. So the three world-changing organisms.
Yeah. Yeah. And three organisms, but a common thread that connects them. And so basically when an organism, you mentioned the single-celled organisms, they're called cyanobacteria. They're still with us today, by the way. They haven't gone anywhere. They're responsible for about half of the photosynthesis in the ocean, even to today. If you go through time, how can organisms really change the world? Well, the way they change the world is they radically change their access to energy, and they radically change their access to food. And so for photosynthetic organisms, like organisms that can build their bodies using sunlight energy and elements that they pull from their environment, doing photosynthesis in a more efficient way, for example, allows them access to more energy. And they use that energy to gather the other things they need from their environment. And so cyanobacteria innovated, basically put together in one organism, a new way of capturing energy and a new way of self-fertilizing, basically, pulling nitrogen from the environment. Nitrogen is a key element for photosynthesis and for all life, for proteins, all proteins. So cyanobacteria, way back when, merged these two innovative things, and they dumped a waste product into the environment, and that waste product happened to be oxygen, which did not exist. Free oxygen, two atoms bound to each other, did not exist in the atmosphere at the time. And so when they pumped enough oxygen into the environment, it actually radically changed the world, like way more than humans have, way more even than meteorite impacts have.
The climate biologist said, okay, we talk about the big five, but this great oxidation event is not in there, and it's arguably maybe one of the biggest mass extinctions, if you can.
Yeah, I think in the book I call it the biggest environmental catastrophe of all time. And I think that's unarguably true. I mean, for 2 billion years or 1.5 billion years, life on Earth existed with no free oxygen. And so everything in the ocean, for example, was living in a place where you or I or fish or any other multicellular organism would just die. And then all of a sudden, and I put that in air quotes, I know we're on a podcast, so people can't see it, but all of a sudden, meaning over hundreds of millions of years, the cyanobacteria produced enough oxygen to change the state of the atmosphere so that it went from having no oxygen to this free oxygen that like you or I could breathe. Probably not right away in terms of the amount, but that's a detail. That totally changes what organisms win and lose in the environment. Like completely shifts who can succeed and who can't. And so it was inevitably an an enormous environmental catastrophe, it also set the stage for all multicellular life, which needs free oxygen in the environment to come, many hundreds of millions of years or even billions of years later in evolutionary time. So it's not that. I think there's a really important lesson from that transition, and then that I think is very, very relevant to the human situation. It is not that life on Earth can't exist on a planet that has no oxygen, and it's obviously the case that life can exist on a planet that has oxygen. Living through the transition from one state to another is the hard part. It's not living in the conditions, it's living through the transition that's hard. So if we come to the modern, let's imagine that we pump so much greenhouse gas into the atmosphere that the world is tropical again from pole to pole. It's not that humans couldn't live in a world that was tropical from pole to pole, but transitioning the 10 billion of us from our current climate, or the soon to be 10 billion of us from the current climate to that world, and all the other organisms on the planet having to transition in 100 years from our world now to that world, it's the transition that's hard. It's not the end state. And so I think that's an important, the cyanobacteria created the biggest environmental catastrophe of all time, and life went on, but living through the transition wasn't so great. And the same is true of the second world changing organisms, which are land plants. They're much more recent in geologic history. Again, in air quotes, they come out of the ocean something like 400 million years ago. So just to give you a sense, 9/10 of Earth's history was already over by the time land plants emerged. And they also sort of precipitate a change in the climate and initiate a sort of radical transition that ends up not being so great for the early land plants. They end up they start in a world that's all tropical, and they end in a world that's kind of in an ice age. And so a lot of them were challenged by that. Land plants also made it through that transition and are very abundant, obviously, today. Living through the transition is the hard part. So the thing that is similar about humans to our world-changing predecessors is that we too have discovered a new source of energy. Actually, it's the fossilized remains of the land plants. That's what coal is. We too make our own fertilizer. We can pull nitrogen from the air the way the cyanobacteria did to change the world. We can mine phosphorus from deposits the way land plants did from the rocks in the continents where they emerged. We've combined the biogeochemical acumen of the cyanobacteria with that of the land plants. And as a result, we're changing the world way, way faster than they did. Like hundreds of thousands, maybe 1 million times faster than they did. And living through that transition is going to be really tricky, which is why we want to limit the scope of the transition as much as possible, because it's already going to be very, very fast. And we have to figure out how to slow it down and keep it as small as possible.
And so what are we doing from a perspective of the life's formula when we take carbon out of the ground, the fossilized carbon, and we burn it?
Yeah, so maybe it's worth explaining what I talk about in the book in terms of life's formula. So all organisms are made of elements, and all organisms are made primarily of the first 5 elements that I'm going to list. Hydrogen first, oxygen, carbon, nitrogen, and phosphorus. Hydrogen and oxygen together are in water. So that's why life is so important. Why water is so important to life. Carbon is sort of our energy storage system. So all organic carbon molecules, essentially photosynthesizers like plants and cyanobacteria, they take sunlight energy and they store it in carbon compounds. That is a stored energy that they can use. We then eat those plants, or we eat animals that eat plants, and we burn that energy and use it to fuel our bodies. So plants and cyanobacteria and other photosynthetic organisms are called primary producers. They can produce their own matter from unliving matter using the energy of sunlight and water. we are consumers of them, right? So we eat other things to get our energy. So we can't use the sunlight directly. We get our energy from the carbon that they've stored. So your question was, when we dig up coal and burn it, or dig up oil and burn it, what are we doing? Well, we're not fueling our bodies with that stuff, but we're fueling everything else about our society. And one of the things that makes us very different from other world-changing organisms is that our effect isn't really about the number of people that are here. Our effect is really about the energy and other materials we use for everything else. So we don't need all of the carbon in coal to fuel our internal metabolism and keep us walking around. We need it to fuel our industrial economy and to keep our lights on and our Zoom meetings working and our industry going and all of that stuff. Which means that we don't need the waste product of carbon dioxide that comes with burning fossil fuels. We just need the energy that runs our economy. And so that's a way out that we have, that the other world-changing organisms who used carbon directly for their own bodies didn't have. If there are more plants, they take more carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. Just that's the way it works. But if there are more humans, we don't need to put more carbon dioxide back into the atmosphere because we're not getting our benefit from that. And that's true for nutrients too. So we need a certain amount of nitrogen and phosphorus in our bodies so that we can live. But the vast majority of our use of nitrogen and phosphorus is lost to the environment before it even gets in our mouths. So we use it for fertilizer. If you dump 100 units of fertilizer on a farm right now, something like 10% of that gets into your mouth. And that's if you're a vegetarian. If you eat meat, it's more like 4%. So we're using a huge amount of this critical element that helps drive and determine what life wins and loses on Earth. And we're dumping it into the environment. Why? We're dumping it in the environment because we want 4% of it to eat. We can do better than that. And we're working on that.
Yeah, this is really one of the things I appreciate about the book is you said earlier, maybe you called it reductionist, but it's, I'm working on a book in the Dutch translation, it's called Climate Madness. Because the reason I chose that title is because if you just think logically and you reduce it to, okay, what is actually going on here, then it starts to make sense what is happening and what we could do. And then, yeah, whatever I call madness is like, why don't we do that as humans and all that stuff. Yeah, just the first step to say, okay, there's the table of chemical elements. Let's just focus on these 5. It's really like I put on some new glasses and I'm looking at the world in this way because many of the things you say in the book they're completely logical. That if I'm in a tropical rainforest, I don't need to worry so much about water. But if I'm in the desert, I need to worry about water. Yeah, of course. If you're an organism that's living in the sea, yeah, you don't need to worry about water. But yeah. So, but it's kind of, and it has this beauty as well. It's like this balance between the elements, and sometimes it's more in balance and sometimes it's more out of balance. Yeah, so that's what I like about this analysis, because there's so much talk about, yeah, but we need fossil fuels and we need the energy. So one of the things you say is that, okay, we need, but we also know how to produce this energy without the greenhouse emissions. So what if we could do that? What if we could provide food for the whole world, but look at where our food system is so inefficient?
Yeah, I think that and I spoke earlier about how it sort of changed my vision on an environmental movement and environmentalism in general to be more solutions oriented. And I think that it is, at least in my opinion, the idea that we're going to talk everyone out of using energy, sort of a virtue, let's all live more humbly, life, material things don't matter. I agree with all of those things, but I also am very aware of the constraints that the Earth system puts on us, which is that we need to change and we need to change really fast. And in order to change really fast and reduce our emissions and overuse of other nutrients really, really fast, we need to work with the tools that we have at hand right now. We can't wait for a global society that has abandoned the use of energy. Like I don't even think we would like to live in that world, but even if we would like to live in that world, we're not going to live in that world in the next decade or the next 2 decades. And that's where we need to make radical change in the management of these elements. And so given that, I think that the only answer is to say, how can we provide for the energy and food demands that we have in a way that limits the damage and slows the damage and transitions us to a sort of stable, livable space in the next decade, in the next 2 decades, not in 100 years, not in 1,000 years, now. And so how do we do that? Well, you asked before if I was optimistic. California, for example, over the last month has had basically between 1 and 6 hours of the day completely powered by renewable electricity, 100%. Right? That's impressive. Is it enough? No. Does it cover all 24 hours of the day? No. Is it way better than before? Certainly when I lived in California. Yeah, it's way better. It's true in many places around the world. Southern Australia is now talking about being 24/7 renewable electricity and batteries by 2027. If you had asked anyone 3 years ago, nobody would have said that was possible. So we can do we already know enough to do, let's say, 70% of what we need to do to get to 70% of the solution. Do we know how to get there 100%? Absolutely not. Should we start with the 70% as fast as possible and figure out the rest as we go? That's the solution that I see. And I don't see the idea that we don't know how to get there 100% as any sort of barrier. Imagine you're back in 1900 and people are just starting to build electricity grids. Do you think people said we shouldn't build electricity grids because we can't electrify everybody's house in the whole world right now? No, they started building, right? And they started building as fast as they could and to transition because there was a better future with electricity than without it. And they built it out. And it would have seemed ludicrous to say we shouldn't use electricity because the grid doesn't exist yet. And in the same way, we shouldn't allow the fact that we don't know how to run on 100% renewables with storage everywhere yet stop us from racing down that path as fast as we can. It often strikes me that the people who most believe in human ingenuity in some cases completely disregard it when it doesn't go in the direction that they want.
Yeah.
And
yeah, that's so interesting about how do we deal with uncertainty and wanting to control everything, because we know from the history of science that the moment you start working on something, it means that the economy also starts to change. It also starts to get more funding. Just look at COVID. Because of course coronavirus was a thing already before the COVID pandemic, but at one point, all these brilliant people started to spend hours every day to think about it and to test and to everything like that. I think it's just so, sometimes we make it very complicated, but sometimes it's just a matter of focus. Okay, if you don't know, if you know from the beginning that this is a dead-end street, okay, maybe this is an argument to start, but we know that, how I look at it sometimes is maybe one of the primary jobs of our generation is to buy time for our children and grandchildren, because if we don't do something now, the window of opportunity for them is closing fast and they won't have the possibilities. But if we do the things that we can do now to buy them a little bit more time, and also start working on the problem, and of course, they can take it from there.
There are really there are three pieces of dealing with the problem that we have with regards to climate and sustainability in general. Piece number one is to try as best we can to limit the effects. So 2 degrees is better than 3 degrees is better than 4 degrees. Okay, so we have to limit the effects. you're absolutely right about buying time. The next thing we have to do is slow the transition. So for a given amount of warming, let's say 2 degrees, it's better if it warms 2 degrees by 2200 than by 2100 or then by 2050, because the rapidity of change is really what's hard to deal with, right? And so those two things are very important. And then the third thing that's really important is we need, and this is a critical piece, I don't talk about it as much in the book as I think it deserves. Maybe it's a separate book and probably one not written by me. However much change we have to deal with and however fast it is, it's going to be felt the most by the people with the fewest resources to adapt and who have done the least to cause the problem. And so there's a really important equity and justice consideration of how do we help those people manage whatever transition we have imposed upon them. It is not possible to limit for there to be no transition. It's not possible to slow it down to stop it, right? We can only slow it down. But so however much change we have, it is incumbent upon a civilized society to make that process as to buffer those with the fewest resources to adapt from those changes. And so those are sort of three key, not independent components, but three what I would consider components that need to be really thought deeply about as we enact solutions to the climate and food and water problems that we have.
Yeah, so limiting the amount of warming, slowing it down, and climate justice, I would say, the third one.
Yeah, so limiting the total amount, slowing down however much the amount is, so stretching it out as long as possible, and then climate justice. And I think the justice side of it, I find to be really difficult to think about because we all agree what a degree Celsius is, right? Americans might not know, and you have to translate into Fahrenheit, but still, we all understand what a degree is, even if we don't understand what that means in terms of climate. The world does not agree on what justice means. There's not a unified definition of justice. And so I think that's where things get really messy. And it's outside my area of expertise, but you and I can agree that we want justice, but we can have completely different definitions of what that is.
Yeah.
And so I think that you're a philosopher, in the philosophy of science.
And that's the topic of Plato's book, by the way, is what is justice? That's the whole question. Yeah, we still haven't figured it out.
Right, we still haven't figured it out. And I think it's unlikely we're going to figure it out in the next 2 years, right? So, and so in the theory of in the philosophy of science, there's this idea that it's easier to make progress in a field if everyone agrees on the definitions of the terms. So if everyone agrees what DNA is, it's easier to make progress on genomics. If we're fighting about what DNA is, then it's very hard to make progress on genomics. Similarly, I think we will always be slower to achieve a just world than we will to solve some technical scientific problem, because the word justice, as you pointed out, has been with the ambiguity of that word has been with us forever.
That's actually a topic that I'm working on a lot and that I find really interesting. And I was just thinking that pretty much the same goes what we talked about earlier, that we don't need to have all the knowledge to start working on a problem. So I've been studying interdisciplinarity. So how can different fields talk to each other when they have different paradigmatic assumptions and everything like that? And one of the ways is using kind of traveling concepts. So like a concept like hybrid is a concept that comes from biology, but it's also used in engineering and whether we have a hybrid meeting and everything like that. And I think that's one part, is that a concept can be a common ground, justice as well, I think. And I think the same part is that we actually don't have to all agree on it, as long as we can have a conversation about it. And just before we move on to the climate models, maybe. So my approach at this moment, my thinking at this moment, is that the professionals are maybe the answer to that. Because if we start philosophizing about what is justice, we can have a long discussion. But some of the interviews before were with healthcare professionals. So the climate crisis is the biggest threat to global health, and the healthcare sector has a lot of experience in health inequalities and all that stuff. So they actually have done a lot of work to work out this concept of justice to their field. And of course, the other profession is law professionals. So the rights of nature movement, I think, is maybe one of the most important movements in law. But there's also people who are working on children's rights, because this is an issue that directly affects children's rights, and it might be another way to take maybe a government or a fossil fuel company to court from the perspective of children's rights, and then it becomes very concrete.
Yeah, so I don't know if you're familiar, but in the state of Montana in the US, a bunch of kids sued the state.
Exactly.
And the state did not contest. So the students won their case, claiming that, further investment in fossil fuel jeopardizes their right to a healthy environment, essentially, which is in the state constitution. And they won that case. So yeah, I mean, I am skeptical that any of those legal evolutions will happen fast enough to make it a big difference to the next several decades. I think that it's possible, but I hope that it's not necessary to rely on that, because I don't think it can go at the speed that we need. But maybe. I'm not an expert in either legal or philosophical matters, and so some things in U.S. law at least move really fast, and other things don't, and we'll see.
Yeah, that's one of the things I get hope from, is that you're working at this problem from a biogeochemical perspective, but there's also lawyers working on this, but also security professionals, because of course climate security is a thing in healthcare professionals, and we don't know which one is going to be the tipping. But I think if all these different professions work at it, it might go fast. Yeah.
I teach a class in climate solutions, and one of the things I really like about it is that any student interested in absolutely anything can be a part of solutions to these problems. These are society-wide problems. And so what's great about that is that everybody brings different talents, different weaknesses, but also different strengths to the table. And everyone can be involved in this and has to be involved in this. And so, if you're a theater major or an economist or an English major, or you haven't gone to college at all, it doesn't matter. You can make a contribution towards building this more resilient and hopefully equitable and just society that does not depend on the mismanagement of Earth's fundamental rhythms. And so I'm very hopeful, and my students find it very hopeful, because they come into the class and they say, I haven't had a lot of science. I don't do that. And I say, it doesn't matter. We need lawyers. We need persuasive speakers. We need artists. We need everybody. This is the problem of our century, and how we readjust ourselves to the fundamental biogeochemical constraints of the planet is going to determine in large part how successful we are as a species in the long run. And, that's a grand challenge, but one I think we can rise to face.
Yeah, great. Yeah, so I guess that's also how we are different from cyanobacteria and plants, right?
Right. I mean, I talk about this a lot in the book, that we share with them our world-changing roots. And by that, I mean, we have discovered a new source of energy. We have figured out how to get these key elements of nitrogen and phosphorus, which are critical for our food supply. We've figured out how to pull the nitrogen from the air and pull the phosphorus from the rock. And we have figured out how to stay hydrated on land, which, as I point out in the book, is no small feat. It's, as you said earlier, it's easy if you live in the ocean to have plenty of water. But if you live on land, it's really hard. And so, human civilizations were always close to water. And now we have built so many dams and we pull so much water out of the ground that we have figured out how to keep us, and more importantly, all the plants we grow and all the animals we grow with enough water, at least most of the time in most places. So we've solved all of these puzzles. And these are the same puzzles that the cyanobacteria and the plants had to solve. But, and I alluded to this earlier, one really important difference that we have from them is that the vast majority of the elements that we're using, the water and the carbon and the nitrogen and the phosphorus, we're not using in our bodies, we're using outside our bodies. And so we don't need it. We don't need them to keep us alive. We need them to keep our industrial society alive. And if we can figure out a way to keep all the benefits of our global society without the waste products that right now we generate through mismanagement, we'll be even better off. And they didn't have that out, because for every extra plant, for every extra cyanobacterial cell, they had an extra impact. Just to think about it sort of more holistically, the average American emits more than 10 times as much CO2 as the average Kenyan. Now, you could argue that the average American has a higher quality of life than the average Kenyan, but the question is, can we get the same benefits without all that extra CO2, right? Like that's a fun, and if we can, then then we've solved the problem. So it's not the number of people, it's the amount of stuff we emit by accident in getting all the stuff that we want. That's the problem. So we have an out. Sorry, that wasn't very articulately said.
No, sure. It's very clear. Yeah, I just have 3 questions or topics that are a little bit more specific. And
sure.
So one actually relates to this, which is, do you talk a lot with, they call themselves climate skeptics?
So I guess what I would say is I talk to everybody.
Yeah.
My wife would say maybe a little too much. I don't. Let me preface it by saying I don't think anybody wakes up in the morning wanting to make the world a worse place. So to the extent that we have disagreements about what we should do or how we should do it, that seems very reasonable. And I think it's always important to recognize that other people who you disagree with are not necessarily evil or worthy of contempt. They just have a different point of view. Now, when I run into people, so I would say that I would split this broad term climate skeptics into 2 categories. One category is people who think that climate change is either not happening or that humans aren't causing it. When I interact with those people, it very quickly becomes clear that they're really not talking about the science. They're talking about a feeling. And that feeling is, I don't want you to tell me what I can do. That's generally what it is. And that then manifests as skepticism. So if I'm talking to someone like that and I say, oh, I actually study that, like as a scientist, what makes you skeptical? They almost certainly say, well, I'm not really an expert, or, they throw something that they heard out and I say, oh, actually, that's a good point, but there's this. And that conversation almost always, if they're willing to have that conversation, almost always ends with them sort of saying, well, I actually don't really know about the climate, but this other thing. And I'll give you the most profound example I ever had of that. It was very transformative for me. And maybe it doesn't translate into a European context as much. Well, maybe it does. I don't know. You can tell me. I was on, I'll just keep it very broad. I was on a speaking engagement, and there was a family on this trip that I was the speaker for, who was very, very conservative and did not believe in climate change, air quotes, right? And I was giving 3 lectures, actually lectures that sort of form the basis of this book. This was before the book was written. And I said to the people, like, I understand that you don't. I would be very honored if you would listen to these 3 lectures, and then we could talk about it afterwards, because, I build up this idea that the way organisms change the world is through these elements, and one of them is through, flows through the carbon cycle, and that changes the climate, and that's happened in the past, and it's happening now. So they very politely listened to all three of my lectures over a series of days. And at the end of it, I came up to them when I finished my last talk. I sat down with them at dinner and I said, I would love to hear your perspective now that you've heard what I had to say. And the father of the group turned to me and said, your lectures were all very good, but I just wonder if you cared as much about unborn children as you do about the environment, uh, I would have more respect for your opinion. Now, I had not spoken about the abortion issue, of course, at all in my talks, but that was really informative for me because what he was saying is, I fundamentally disagree. I am making an assumption about what you believe about abortion, which to him a very important issue. He's making an assumption about what Stephen Porder, believed about that. And based on his assumption, which again had never come up in conversation, he was unwilling to trust anything that I had to say about anything because he thought of me as an immoral person. And so when I run into I'm not saying it's always that extreme, but when I run into climate skeptics who opine about the science, who aren't scientists, I often find that it is not really about the science. It's about some fundamental underlying thing. So that's one group, people who deny the science. There is no denying that humans are causing climate change. Like it's as well established in science as anything else in science at this point. It is not a matter of scientific debate. It is not a matter of uncertainty. It's as certain as DNA is how inheritance is passed on, or that that gravity works the way it does. Like it's fundamental. Humans are causing climate change.
Maybe we can get into that first a little bit, because that's before you go to the second group, because that's really what I appreciated in the book, is how you spend time on explaining. You're acknowledging, yet these are pretty big transitions and pretty big decisions that we would have to take if climate change is in fact happening as the scientists say it is. Mm-hmm. And then you spend time on speaking about climate models. And part of my day job is looking into misinformation and disinformation. And I speak a lot with climate skeptics, but I'm also very interested from a philosophy of science perspective about this part about the models. So some of the things that they say is that, well, if you look at the past, it's not so bad until this point. And climate scientists, they use models, but yeah, models are just models, they're very unreliable. And also they have been not so good at predicting what is happening right now. In those conversations, I always struggle because on the one hand, I say like, yeah, but these are, this is very, very certain. But on the other hand, I also know that there are always uncertainties and models. And of course, in climate science, there's a lot of unresolved questions and a lot of things that we don't know. So that's right. How do you balance these two, and can you still say, yeah, how can we be so sure that this is actually happening in this way?
Yeah. So there's a couple. This is a great question, and I want to start by acknowledging that most all of the people who quote unquote believe the science don't understand the science any better than the people who don't believe the science, right? So if you ask the average person on the street to explain a climate model, they won't be able to, regardless of their political affiliation. It's very complicated, and there's no it's like in the US, the COVID vaccine is contentious, but you don't need to understand how they made the COVID vaccine to be vaccinated. And so you don't need to understand how you build an airplane to get on an airplane and have the pilot fly you safely to where you're going, right? So there's lots of things in life where you don't understand how it works, and it works, right? Like Zoom, I don't know how Zoom is working. How am I talking to you? It's kind of magic, but it's working, right? So how do we know that the climate models are trustworthy? Well, there are several ways that one could ask that question, but for me, actually, the most compelling way has changed over the course of time as we've waited longer and longer. So the first climate model that was ever written down was written down by Svante Arrhenius in 1896. Um, he by hand wrote a paper called on the effects of carbonic acid on the temperature on the ground. It's a great paper. You can download it and read it yourself. It's awesome. And in it, he calculated, he was very concerned about the coming of the next ice age and was worried that it would hurt Europe if another ice age appeared. And so he calculated by hand what would happen if you cut the amount of CO2 in the air by 50%, or what if you increased it by 50%, or if you doubled it. And he calculated for different times of the year and different latitudes what the temperature would be if you did that. If you take that very, very simple model that had one factor in it, just the CO2 in the air, and you force that model with the CO2 that we actually have put into the air, that is the actual concentrations of CO2, it almost perfectly predicts what the temperature change has been over the last 50 to 60 years. And the places where it gets it wrong are periodic fluctuations associated with El Nino. So he didn't know about El Nino, which is a 5 to 7 year sort of climate cycle. It's one of the reasons the Earth is so hot this particular year in 2023 and 2024. Anyway, so why do I bring that up? A good model makes a risky prediction that comes true. So what do I mean by a risky prediction? A risky prediction is a prediction that is very unlikely to come true if your model is wrong. So I'll give you an example of a not risky prediction, and then I'll give you an example of a risky prediction. A not risky prediction is the weather tomorrow is going to be very much like the weather today. And that's because I'm wearing a blue shirt. So that's my model. Model is the color of my shirt determines the weather. Why is that a bad test of my model? Because there's an 80% chance that the weather tomorrow is going to be like the weather today, no matter what color shirt I'm wearing. So I can make a model that predicts with 80% certainty, right, the weather tomorrow, but it's just because it's going to happen anyway. That's a not risky prediction. A risky prediction is Edmund Halley saying a comet is going to come back in 76 years based on my calculations, based on Newton's law of gravity. It's very unlikely that that comet would appear exactly when predicted if his model is wrong, because that would be an extraordinary coincidence. That's a risky prediction. Arrhenius was not making a model to predict what the temperature was going to be like from 1950 to 2020. He was just writing what he thought was a model that described the climate of the planet. The fact that he wrote that in the late 1890s and it works today is quite incredible, right? And makes it very likely that his idea of what is fundamentally controlling the climate is likely to be correct.
It's closer to the beginning of the Industrial Revolution than to our own moment in time.
That's right. And he also speculated that even back then that we might be burning enough coal to prevent the coming of the next ice age, right? So that's not a fancy computer model, right? Like he did that with a pen and paper, or maybe a pencil and paper, I don't know. But like that was all by hand. If you look at modern climate models are born really in the 1960s, 1970s. Earliest ones published that were sort of global and robust in the 1980s. Unfortunately, we have waited quite a long time since then to do anything. And if you run those models, again, forcing them with the amount of CO2 that we've put into the air, they actually get the temperature quite right. If you go back to those old models and run them forward over the last 40 years, they get it right too. So those are tests of the model. I wish we hadn't tested them in that way because that means we're changing the greenhouse gas concentration in the atmosphere so much that we can detect it. The earliest climate modelers predicted that we probably wouldn't have enough data to see the effects until about 2000, which is exactly when we started having enough data to start seeing the effects. So we have a very good understanding of the climate system, and it's embodied in these models. Let's now say that there is uncertainty. We don't know, for example, the regional effects super well. Precipitation is hard to get out. So how much rain, where, is it snow, is it rain? Those things are going to be hard to get at. Some of the feedbacks in the system, like, is the Arctic sea ice going to disappear? It's been disappearing faster than we thought it would. Our glacier's going to melt. They've been melting faster than we thought they would. So there are things we are very likely to get wrong, but in the most general sense, the amount of CO2 that we put into the air directly affects the temperature. The sub effects of that, how ocean circulation changes, where you get more drought, where you get more storms, are hurricanes bigger, are they more intense, whatever. Those things are the things that are uncertain within the model, but this fundamental effect of CO2 in the atmosphere has been known since the 1850s, actually, and experiments done by Eunice Foote, who is a woman who got no credit for it at the time. But she did experiments all the way back in the 1850s showing that the amount of CO2 in the air directly affects the temperature. There's no doubt about that. In fact, it's linear. For every extra ton of CO2 we put into the air, we get an incremental degree of warming. It's a linear correlation. And so this is not in dispute. The details of like where, when, exactly how much, those things are things we're still trying to understand. And of course, those are really important for regional policy planning, right? How you adapt in each place doesn't matter what the average global temperature is. It matters what's happening in your place. So there's a lot left to do, but the fundamentals are unequivocally undeniable. I don't know if you want to talk more about models, and we can keep talking about them if you'd like.
I'm curious about the second type of skeptics that you speak with.
Okay, so I find this to be I think a flaw in the environmental movement thinking. They tend to label anyone who disagrees with the rapid elimination of fossil fuels as a climate denier or a climate skeptic. And I think that that is a unfortunate lumping. There is no question that humans are causing climate change, but how fast and what we do to change our society depends very much on how much you discount what's happening right now versus the future and alternative visions for what the future looks like. And I think that that's a political conversation and a social conversation that is, it's not denying that, like, so in other words, if you said to me, look, I understand humans are causing climate change. I don't care what happens in 2100. I care what's happening right now. And right now I like the way my life is, and I don't want an electric car, and I don't want to get rid of my furnace, and I want to keep flying, and I don't care. I would have profound disagreements with that person. But it's not that they're denying a truth. It's that they have different values and they're valuing different things. I might think that if they only knew what I knew, they would change their mind. And it's incumbent upon me to try to change their mind. And I try to do that all the time. But they're not denying an objective reality, right? They have a different set of things that they want, you know, like, and so I just think it's important to split those two things apart, because there's no legitimate disagreement about the science of climate change or whether humans are causing climate change or even really how warm it's going to get if we do X or Y. But what we should do about that really depends on where you are and what you're thinking about and what's important to you. And to invalidate both in one big group, I think, makes it harder to reach common ground and to make progress on this issue that's going to ultimately require all of us to work together.
Yeah, that's actually a great connection to the second topic. And actually, I would love to talk more about models, but that's just so I really like to connect it as well to different issues, because some listeners might have more connection with one issue or another. I think what you say connects as well to Lee McIntyre's work. I talked with him before about disinformation and about science denial, and this is something that the research is saying. It's about identity. It's not about the evidence, it's about identity. And one of the, let's say, climate madnesses is that the issue becomes politicized, so that if you say, yeah, I think climate change is real and it's something we have to do something about, someone else said, oh, then you must also have this particular stance on abortion because people who believe that also believe that. Well, so then it becomes very difficult to reach a common ground. And another concept that I really like, but which is also sometimes abused by climate skeptics, is the concept of carbon tunnel. that this must you must like this because you say, well, it's not just, there are there are also 4 other elements. It's not just about carbon. And one case that is playing out now in the Netherlands, but I've also read reports about, the Netherlands is maybe the first country in which this is happening, because this is going to be in many more countries an issue, and that's what we call the nitrogen crisis. Mm-hmm. It's where particularly farmers, it's not just farmers, but also construction work and everything, they're not meeting European Union regulations when it comes to nitrogen, because nitrogen has an effect on the environment. And there are sometimes there were even on the same day that in The Hague, where our government is, there was a protest by Extinction Rebellion against fossil subsidies, and there was a protest by the farmers against these regulations. Yeah. And this is also very polarized, where also people are saying, oh, the police is much harsher on one group than the other, or something like that. So these are protesters that are concerned with the effect of 2 elements, nitrogen and carbon. So I was wondering, how can you help make this connection between what we call the nitrogen crisis and maybe the climate crisis, which you could say is also a carbon crisis?
Yeah. So, I mean, it's not just those 2 either. Like, water is hugely contentious everywhere. So if you look at, the water coming out of the Himalayas, and you look at India and Pakistan and Kashmir, like, water is at the heart of that, at least in part. If you look in the Middle East, water is at the heart of the ability to live, right? Because you're living in a very arid system, and so fighting over water is really important. If you look in the Western US, you're not allowed in Colorado to collect the water that falls on your roof and use it, because that water is belonging to someone else. So in dry places, water is critically fought over as well. And if you look at phosphorus, most of the phosphorus that we use to fertilize the farm fields around the world comes from West Africa, and that area is also being fought over. So Western Sahara is trying for independence from Morocco. This is a politically contentious. I wrote an op-ed in the New York Times a decade ago now about agriculture and the use of phosphorus, and I got an email from one of the political parties involved in this saying, you use the wrong terminology for this political dispute, because I was writing about phosphorus. And so all of these elements are going to be at the heart of political contention moving forward. And that's because they're critical to our success as a society. And we can't live without them. Or at least with water, carbon, water, phosphorus, and nitrogen. Most of the carbon pollution that we produce, we can, as I've talked about before, we can get the energy we need without the carbon emissions that we don't want. But for nitrogen, phosphorus, and water, we're stuck with it. It's for our needs, our bodies. So how do we deal with that? Well, here too, there's a lot of room for hope. So there are a lot of people working really hard on keeping crop production high, allowing farmers to make a living, which is a very hard thing to do in the US. I'm less familiar with the EU agriculture and Netherlands agriculture in specific, but it's not an easy life and it's hard to make a living. But there are ways we can farm smarter that allow farmers to make a living without the unwanted spilling of nitrogen and phosphorus into the environment, which we know has all sorts of bad effects. So nitrogen and phosphorus produce algal growths and pollute our waterways. Nitrogen also can be a strong greenhouse gas when it's moved by microbes out of the soil up into the air. It can also form acid rain and is part of Europe's acid rain problem. So these elements are things we want to keep where we put them. We want to put them on our farm fields. We want the crops to take up exactly as much as we put on, and we want those elements to then come into our mouths. And then we want them to go out into sewage treatment where we recover them in some way. And right now the system is very, very leaky. So farmers are incentivized to overuse, to put them on the fields, and if some washes away, that's not that big a deal because they really have to maximize the amount of growth that they get. And then the rest of our society pays the price for that washing out into the environment. There is innovation there to be had. And I think farmers who see that future coming, and that is a future that is coming, we're going to need to think about the waste that's coming off our farm fields, and particularly the waste that's flowing through our animals. Farmers that embrace that can do really, really clever things now and in the future to mitigate those waste products, those wasted elements that cost us so much to get, and keep them in the crop. And that's a huge step. The other thing I will say, and this I know is contentious in the US, it's also contentious in Europe, we could solve a lot of our agricultural and our nitrogen and phosphorus and water problems if we either stopped eating so much meat, or as Pat Brown, who's the founder of Impossible Food, says, if we stopped using an ancient technology of cows to produce our meat. So if we could make something in a more efficient way than cows currently make meat, we could go a long way to solving our agricultural and environment, the problems of the environment that come through our agricultural system. We could reduce the emissions of methane and nitrous oxide and CO2 from our agricultural sector. We could reduce the amount of land we needed enormously. We could feed people nutritious, more healthy food, and we would reduce costs. So this is the future, I hope, is that we stop relying on antiquated animal technology to produce that kind of food. So, it's not happening this year, but I think that prescient farmers are seeing this, and we're seeing it in the Midwestern agricultural context in the US and the most industrial farms in the world. We're seeing the adaptation of techniques that allow for better management of nutrients. We're seeing it even in China. I understand that there's real concern and legitimate concern of farmers about how are they going to make a living in the face of more regulation. And we need to find a way, but we can and are finding ways. And so we need farmers to work with us, we all need to work together to make it possible for them to make a living, to grow the food we need, and not produce the waste that none of us want.
No. And what's the biggest unresolved question in your field? So from a researcher perspective, that if you would just have unlimited time and funding, you could solve that one.
Well, it's interesting because that's a very good question. And I have sort of a multi-tiered answer. So in my specific sub-discipline, I would say one of the biggest questions is, what is the fate of tropical forests? Is climate change... Well, first of all, tropical forests are soaking up a lot of CO2. As we put more CO2 in the air, they're actually being fertilized a little bit by that, but we don't think that's going to last for very long. And so the fate of tropical forests is hotly debated, and because they play such a big role in the global cycle of carbon, and their growth is limited by these other elements that we've been talking about all during this interview, that's sort of at the core of my fundamental biogeochemistry field. But I would say, and actually it plays very directly into the transition that I've made more towards solutions orientation, that while there are big outstanding questions in the biogeochemistry of tropical forests, by and large, what will determine the fate of tropical forests is whether humans cut them down or not, and not so much their fundamental elemental constraints. And so that second answer, which is a little bit bigger, really embodies my own shift in thinking. I am grounded and really believe in the need for basic science. At the same time, at this moment in history, I think we need to think more broadly than just how carbon and nutrients are cycling through tropical forests, as an example, and to think about the human interaction with that system and how that's going to play out. And so if you go one step further, then the biggest question, and this will not be solved by any amount of funding, is what are we going to choose to do in the next 20 years? Are we going to move to a system where we manage these 5 elements in a way that ensures a minimal and just transition to a new world? Or are we going to continue to fight about it, be unable to come to consensus, unable to solve this problem of wise management of these elements, and push ourselves through and into a very, very, very difficult century? And to me, that's the question ultimately that, again, it's not a funding question, but that's the question I want to answer. And it's a question I want to influence the answer of. And that's why I do what I do.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. It was great talking to you.